Welcome back to Oliver Scholar's CEO Salon series with your host, Dr. Danielle R. Moss. In this episode, as we commemorate Black History Month, we'll discuss the importance of mental health and the Black community. Joining Dr. Moss for this important conversation, help us welcome Marcia Richardson from the University of Pennsylvania and Stephen Powell of the National Cares Mentoring Movement. Let's talk.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this live conversation. I am so excited about speaking to our guests today. This is a conversation we had planned to have for Black History Month, but had to reschedule, and I'm so glad that we were able to invite these discussants back to the CEO Salon series. So without further ado, I want to invite Dr. Marcia Richardson, a fellow Swarthmore classmate, who's had an incredible clinical and academic career, really looking at the mental health in our community. So thank you, Marcia, for agreeing to do this.
Thank you.
So excited. And next we have Stephen Powell from the National Cares Mentoring Movement. Stephen and I also go way back. We had the pleasure of working with each other, really promoting youth development in an organization we both served at previously, and he is doing amazing things at National Cares Mentoring Movement. So thank you both for being part of this conversation. First, rather than read your long bios, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about your background, what brought you to this moment professionally, and why mental health is so important to both of you. So, Marcia, do you want to kick us off?
Oh, I was hoping you would kick it off with Stephen, but okay.
I would have kicked it right back to you.
First and foremost, Danielle, thank you. It's such an honor to finally have our professional paths cross. So I'm really humbled and honored to be a part of this conversation. What brought me here? Oh gosh, 25 plus years working in various mental health agencies, programs, institutions, schools, you name the clinical setting, and I probably have had training or work in. Started out providing treatment for children and youth in residential care in psychiatric hospitals. Used to run a foster care agency, used to direct an outpatient clinic. Right now, I am the director of the School of Mental Health Counseling Program at the University of Penn's Graduate School of Education. And for the past 12 years, I've been working with individuals who want to be healers, who want to be helpers of children and their families. Primarily, I work with students who aspire to be licensed professional counselors and certified school counselors, whom I identify as first responders, especially for those who work in school settings. I also have a small private practice. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And so therefore, I primarily work with women of color, in various professions. And one of the startling statistics that I oftentimes provide in conversations like this is my small private practice, 90% of them are educators. And so we have individuals who are hurting, who are suffering, and they are our educators. And so I oftentimes look at and explore what I call collective trauma. You know, everyone, especially in the past 2.5 years, we've endured some of the most egregious attacks on our health, both physically and mentally. And these are the things that are coming into play in my private practice. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Marcia. Stephen.
I'm supposed to go after that? I mean, really? If I had to say how I got here, Danielle, I would say faith, value, gratitude. When I think about my life and the trajectory of how I got to this point, I go back to a painful point, losing my father at the age of 5,
Mm.
learning from those persons around me the type of traumas that I went through because I didn't understand what death was, but I experienced the loss, right? Just going through all of the phases and withdrawal at school. But having a mother who had this sense of mind to say, you know what, we're all going to get therapy as a family. So I understand the value of that. Now, when it comes to gratitude, just in the world of mentorship. So in my role, I'm the Chief Programs and Partnerships Officer here at the National Cares Mentoring Movement. I've been here for 7 years, but been in the mentoring arena for the last 20 years, and certainly Danielle when we work together in that capacity. But I do this work because I'm extending the gratitude for those mentors who stood in the gap for me. So now I'm in a position where I get to create this constellation of caring organizations that are going to pour into our young people. And we do this as an organization that is a leading recognized entity in the recruitment, training, and deployment of African American mentors, and the only organization on a national scale that's providing holistic academic support, social emotional learning support, career readiness support for young people, and then the parents that support them. So it's not just about supporting the young people for us. We're really taking a deep look at the caregivers that have to take care of our young people in communities around the country.
What have you both seen in terms of ability to access mental health in our communities in the last 2.5 years? And how is that different from the ways in which people were accessing mental health resources before the pandemic?
Mm. It's hard. It is so hard on various levels of exposure for me. Most recently, I can share the story. Most recently, I have a client whose child is in Italy, and they had some significant mental health concerns. And within a month's time, I was just blown away by the level of care and um, collective rallying around this person, the medical doctor, the psychiatrist, the family, obtaining medication, getting evaluations, all within a month's time. It was amazing. Had that person been here in the States, they would still be on the waiting list for care. And it just rattles my brain with all of the many resources that we have here, the struggle, even on the campus where I work, seeking support within a time frame that is meaningful is a struggle. The wait list, the sheer number of people seeking help, and the lack of professionals that are readily available. Oftentimes it's cost prohibitive, even if you have the best insurance, it's a struggle. And then you have the healers who are hurting. Like I said before, we've endured and are experiencing collective trauma. And so even the healers have been under a lot of duress, have been exposed to and are trying to manage what I call vicarious trauma. So they're living through it, and they're seeing those that they're trying to help go through it. And it's a lot. It really is a lot.
I'd echo everything Dr. Richardson mentioned. I'd also add that in some arenas, we're just not as organized, so everybody wants the resources, but it's hard for anyone to say, what's the central place I can go to get those resources? So we've been very focused on collaborating with other organizations like the Association of Black Psychologists, the National Black Child Development Institute, and many others, because what's important for us is to stay in our lane and make sure that we can get those professionals that can support that. But while people are waiting, what I will also say is that I don't believe you have to be a clinician in order to deposit compassion and empathy into the world. And so we're trying to teach the folks in our community to be those thermostats to help control the climate in schools and homes and in their communities. And we do this through our healing modality, which are called wellness mentoring circles. We bring this into schools. We bring it into community centers, into juvenile detention facilities. We do this to parents, right? These are compassion spaces where we can utilize our culturally anchored, healing centered, trauma engaged curriculum called A New Way Forward, Healing What's Hurting Black America, with 10 focal pillars, all created by a 60-member brain trust, starting with heritage, looking at stress and wellness and prosperity and community and media watch, which we absolutely have to pay particular attention to, because what we're seeing and hearing from so many educators and parents around the country is that technology has become the new babysitter. So we don't even know what our young people are taking in on a regular basis, and then it's showing up in school. So as we move through the work, we're always encouraging people. And I'm going to take this quote from our founder, Susan Taylor. Susan L. Taylor is the founder and CEO of the National Cares Mentoring Movement. This work was birthed from what she saw in the devastation post Hurricane Katrina. And what's rooted in all of this is poverty. So we're also disrupting poverty. But she says you have to see people for their wounds and not their behaviors.
Exactly.
So if we're going into a school, if we're going into any entity and we're talking about consciousness shifting, we want anyone who has a contact with that young person, from the school resource officer at the beginning of the day to the principal and anyone in between, to understand the value that we all have to pour into our young people. But we all know we can't pour in if we're half empty or empty. So self-care, prioritizing that, teaching all of our participants how to take these restorative practices outside of the wellness mentoring circles into their homes, into their communities, is really helpful for us.
Yeah. I love that. Can I sign up?
Yes, of course.
Because you speak
Like,
to
for
something.
real.
I mean, you speak to something that is from an academic. You are challenging what we call evidence-based practices. You are pushing for the decolonization of ways in which we can care for our own. The programs and the teachings that are derived from my school comes out of a very westernized, individualistic approach. And it tends to shy away from, or shun, or even stigmatize, these grassroots, these culturally significant approaches that are steeped in healing powers. And so I appreciate that.
We getting hot over here, Danielle. I mean, she's oof. Yes,
Yeah.
Dr. Richardson. And let me just add to that, because our framework is group mentoring, right? So everything we do, our 2-generation approach is group mentoring. And the reason we do this, ladies, is because we know that coming together in group is in our cultural ethos. And if we're going to do anything significant to change the numbers of young people that are impacted by mentoring, and yes, it's important to have the evaluations. All of our work is evidence-based, but again, we have to be able to reach more young people. So for us, it is a goal when we go into a school to say that every young person is going to participate in a wellness mentoring circle, because we're utilizing the group mentoring framework. It's not to say that one-to-one doesn't work. One-to-one absolutely has its place and will continue to have its place. But if we are to reach more young people and to get to changing the consciousness of the entire school and its climate, we believe that group mentoring is the way to do that. And we've seen significant impacts in that area.
Absolutely.
Just thinking back to my own experience, my father passed away my junior year of high school, the week before finals. And I didn't know I could fall apart. So I took like 2 days off from school, and I went back and just kept plugging away and did my finals, and ended up doing an academic program that summer. And then right before I started at Swarthmore College, my cousin passed away at 20. And I actually buried him on one day and reported to campus for my first year of college the following day. It's almost like falling apart and acknowledging what I was carrying was not even on the menu. What I see at Oliver Scholars is that our students have a language around their mental health needs that I certainly didn't have as a younger person, and probably didn't. And I don't think it was that no one cared about, what I was experiencing. I think we are just so accustomed to enduring that failure, all of these things associated with educational attainment in my family, everything was compartmentalized.
Mhm.
And so what I see is young people who are not able, willing, or maybe available to compartmentalize in the ways that I always felt that I had to. Um, how has that impacted people's willingness to access mental health resources? Like, I remember in church, there was like the church service, but there was also like a prayer part of the service where people would just testify.
Mhm.
And that, looking back, I was like, sometimes people were talking about some really heavy and personal things
Yeah.
in in those forums. Like I know my cousin's minister at one point was like, okay, we're not doing that anymore because the level of sharing went beyond, I think, what people could hold themselves. Um, but so what has changed in terms of, that stereotype that Black folks don't want mental health support, and that we can endure anything?
Well,
What has changed?
I think what I've noticed, I have two sons, 16 and 17. Lord have mercy. And what I've
This is
noticed,
hard to believe.
exactly, we won't even mention the 34-year-old, but what I've noticed with their group of friends and just that generation with media, with the use of social media, I mean, they talk about anything and everything on social media. They let it out. They disclose everything and anything. They do their research. The sharing of information. On one hand, I am really looking forward to our present day youth when they are able to make some really great decisions about the state of affairs around us, because their level of inquisitiveness, their initiative and drive, their interest in squashing the stigma of talking about mental illness. Like you said, Danielle, when I was in high school, it wasn't even talked about. And now they're having, circle talks, and now they want to, have. I'm part of an organization called Speak Up, where we go into schools and we have these courageous conversations between students, educators, and parents. We didn't have that kind of opportunity in my middle school and grade school, and so times are changing, and I think becoming more aware and pushing for that desire to have it less stigmatizing is, gives me hope. Um, but accessing the resources to manage it all is still a struggle.
And what I would add, particularly as it relates to Black men, you know, they're in as a Gen X, as a Gen Xer, I'm seeing that we've unlearned some of the things that we sort of saw our parents deal with and not really be open about. So there's more of a modeling, as Dr. Richardson mentioned, there's a more modeling of transparency, vulnerability. We've always had candid conversations in barbershops and beauty salons, and now we have this virtual context in order to do that. But the more we can do that, I mean, the better off we are, right? There's so much that we're holding. And then if we don't have these healthy exchanges where we can release, it manifests in other health conditions. And we start to see our peers checking out of this earth earlier than they should be. So I think the modeling of vulnerability, the modeling of self-care, there's a lot of men who are writing books on this conversation now, and it's giving people permission to be okay. Now, the challenging thing is that we have to get to a space in society where we're making compassion and empathy as infectious as celebrating drama and conflict, because we also have the access that our young people have to just pure nonsense is it's unbelievable. So there's a lot of conflict in thought. You're telling me not to you're telling me to resolve conflict in school, but then I'm watching you share people fighting and disagreeing in public. They're conversations that we have, that we're addressing issues about the Black community that shouldn't be in public discourse. It should be privately done, where there's no embarrassment. So I think that if we're continuing to put compassion at a higher level, we just think about each other differently. One young lady, and when I think about like where we are right now and the conversations we were having and the way we were addressing issues before 2020 and on the other end of this, we can't use the same plays out of an old playbook coming out of a pandemic and that 2020 year of racial reckoning, we'll just call it that. We saw young people around the country voting with their feet. They saw organizations that weren't addressing the issues that were impacting them. And one of our mentees in the Bronx told me, you know what? I have no fear of COVID. What I have a fear of is hope being lost in my community because I understand the consequences that come with that. So we need joy brokers. We need people that are going to pour in hope and just make sure that our young people and adults are getting the support that they need to get through this. We partnered with the Association of Black Psychologists and Danielle, Dr. David Johns and the National Black Justice Initiative in October of 2019 to bring young people from around the country to testify with the Congressional Black Caucus about the rise in Black child suicide. That was in 2019. And when you think where we are right now, I mean, it's just been constant. It's not just with young people, we're seeing it across the board. And people are wondering why. Right? Why is this happening? Not recognizing that it is mental illness. It's a mental illness. When someone feels like they have no other choice, it does leave a tremendous amount of burden and pain and hurt for a community. So understanding our lane, being resourceful, I think all of those things are important. One organization is not going to solve all of these issues.
Absolutely.
What can we do to reorient institutions to acknowledge the importance of mental health?
Well, it's that old saying, hurt people, and hurt institutions hurt communities. So there's got to be an understanding, a collective understanding for those institutions to understand where their place is in turning around the tide in our communities. And it's a slow process. It's definitely a slow process. I think that there's some generational barriers in terms of who feels comfortable enough to have these conversations. And sometimes that requires much smaller convenings before we get to a larger type of conversations. You would think that that's common sense, but people are not always moving in that direction. And everybody's carrying a different level of pain. You just never know what somebody's going through on a regular basis. But I do think that when we start to look at productivity, if you're a CEO or you're a director and you're not prioritizing wellness for your team, you can't go out and promote verbally that wellness is a priority if you're not taking care of your own team or yourself, and if you're not modeling that as a leader. So I think that institutions have a lot of quote unquote self work that has to happen before that external work happens.
Yeah, I totally agree. I work with a lot of schools and a lot of school districts. And like you said, hurt people, hurt organizations, hurt their employees. And one of the things that I am recognizing that's slowly but surely becoming a greater awareness of is the need in focus and self-care. For me to sit and talk with a teacher, to explore with her why she should retire, as opposed to, in her words, torturing herself and her children another year, speaks to the level of inattention to self-care and those restorative practices that can help bring joy to the work that you do. I mean, it's like, as an educator, it pains me to hear another educator say, I sit in my car in tears before I walk into the school building. I want to strangle half of my students. I want to throw a book at my school leader. I want to, the pain is so raw. The stress is unbelievable, and it has only exacerbated in the past 2.5 years. And so, the question of what can systems and organizations do, I totally agree with you, Stephen. I think it's, doing some insightful, introspective work of what do we need to do to shore up the the pain and struggles and the stress and the anxiety and all that swirls around the work we've done. And I think it anchors in self-care and being able to hear voices, hear the stories, hear the narratives of the experiences in these systems, and how the systems aren't sustainable for individuals to work in. And something has to be done.
I think in so many ways we have forgotten that we hire people. And so we use structures and bureaucracy and policy as a way to, in some instances, really dehumanize the people who actually,
Right.
make the work happen.
Yeah.
I always approach a leadership role with this mindset that everything that we have, everything we do, and everything about the way we do this work, somebody just made it up.
Mhm.
I mean, it really is that simple.
Mhm.
And so we have the opportunity to make something up that's different and that feels different. A few years ago, when I was at a different organization, I had a staff member um, who had been with the organization for a really long time, very high performing staffer. Her mother and her husband had cancer at the same time. And so she was caretaking both of them. And she got to a place where she didn't have any time left. And, HR was like, oh my God, what do we do? I mean, you know, can I ask this person who probably is not being paid what they're worth already to take an unleaved period of absence? And so I said, we're going to pay her and let her come back when she's ready,
Mhm.
because we can do that.
Great
Mhm.
call. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
one of her family members did not eventually succumbed to cancer. She did eventually come back to work. And when she got her insurance money, she made a donation to the organization
Mhm.
because she couldn't believe that someone had seen her and
Mhm.
seen the dilemma that she was in to that
Mhm.
extent. Um, but oftentimes people will really cling to policies that are
Mhm.
made, pro forma, right? You're really taking a template. It's
Right.
not like you sat down with intention to think about the culture that you wanted to see in organizations. And so, I think extending that kind of like trust and compassion um, is really important. And, you know, I think about the ways in which other nonprofit leaders can begin to recalibrate their thinking about how
Mhm.
they engage their staff, particularly since, as a sector, we really don't pay often what people are worth. But then I think about the journey of a lot of nonprofit leaders whose boards don't see them as human beings.
Right. Yeah.
How do you then pass
Mhm.
that down? As a line staff person, you kind of see the CEO as this like all-knowing decision maker, right? You're not thinking about the fact that a lot of power often sits with boards, and boards, across the sector generally don't reflect the communities
Right.
that are being served. That one of my goals at Oliver has really been to make sure that our board is increasingly representative. And I think about 25% of our board members now are alum of the organization, which I think is really important.
Awesome.
But we have these like pay to play um, ideas about who sits on the board.
Mhm.
What does value mean? And
Mhm.
Right.
in my 20 years of experience, sometimes the person with the biggest wallet is the most destructive person, can be the most destructive person, right? And is often very far removed from the experiences and what's happening in the community being served. I don't know how we train leaders to recalibrate themselves.
That story reminds me of my own personal experience of how when I was in my doctoral program, I was a single parent. And my mentor, and this is one of the reasons why I love to give back to my students and to others who are trying to thrive and do better for themselves. But I'll never forget, my job was actually on the line. They were thinking about laying me off because I was in a full-time doctoral program. I was doing an internship, and I was also assistant director of this organization. And it's like my plate was full, but I needed to work to keep a roof over my head, and And I'll never forget, my boss said to me, he said, "Listen, Marcia, mental illness is a 24/7 job. So you can't come in 9 to 5, find what you can do to help this organization keep running. If it's at 11 o'clock at night or 2 a.m. in the morning, you go do you. I have trust in your ability to not take advantage of this opportunity, whatever." And for 3 years, I was able to work like that on a modified schedule, and I still gave 110% to the job. And that flexibility in his mind, that was a gift. I don't know if he realized how much of a gift that was, because I literally was contemplating quitting school because I couldn't do both. He allowed an opportunity for me to do both. And I always said, if I was ever in a position to pay that forward for another struggling student or another colleague or subordinate, I definitely would do that. So, and I've been able to, which is which has been great. Yes, thinking outside of those systems, thinking outside of the box. That was something that Swarthmore taught me. Think outside of the box. So yeah.
What are some ways, Stephen, that you're seeing school systems that National Cares works with apply some kinds of innovation, right? Not just in terms of students, but also in terms of like bringing faculty and staff into the fold to support mental wellness in schools?
I'm going to use so this past, that's a great question, Danielle. Last August, before we entered a new school, it's important to kind of like just lay out the phase for going into a school. So the first thing we'll ask the school's leadership to identify students that we call our CARES ambassadors. So we're talking about 15 to 20 students, high performing, in the middle, low performing. We want the full cross section. They're going to help us understand what their peers are going through. And the way that they do that is that we put them through 5 sample wellness mentoring circles that are kind of framed like focus groups. But the young people are essentially telling us these are the issues that are really most pertinent to our peers. So when we finally bring the work into the school, their peers are recognizing their peers as leaders. My peers helped to bring this program in. So we're entrusting that we believe them to be young leaders. But one thing I thought was very innovative is the way that we were able to merge our wellness mentoring circles that we do for young people into teacher professional development. So last August, we held a wellness mentoring circle for 2.5 hours for educators. We've also done this in corporate America, but when teachers can say, oh my God, the fact that I can just simply take these restorative practices, feel like I'm a part of the ecosystem, that's really important. Dr. Richardson said something earlier that made me think about a conversation just last week in Chicago while we were talking to different educators. And young people are a lot more savvy than they were when I was younger. They are. Their level of being unapologetic about pushing social justice and checking the power structure and saying, hey, you know what? We don't see us reflected in the board. They're so much more further ahead than us. And I feel like they understand how to use that blueprint. But what young people and the educators were saying in a few schools in Chicago were, you guys were doing all this conversation around SEL, and then right after that, you just started testing the crap out of us. Testing. Right. So how can I really believe anything if the SEL is just a campaign? Save it.
Right.
One of the things that hurts our communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, are drive-by campaigns, drive-by mentoring campaigns. Somebody gets a grant, they pop in with something. The SEL, are we really practicing SEL? Because if young people see us talking it, and then right behind that, we're just testing away and not understanding what they're coming to school with and dealing with, then they just go, you know what? I'm not buying any of this.
Right.
So if we're really going to prioritize it, we really have to prioritize it. And as you talked about the teachers sitting in the parking lot, and I mean, like, I don't know. First of all, I'm just going to publicly thank every teacher in America right now on this webinar, because it's no one thanks them enough. And there's not a profession on this planet that has not benefited from a teacher pouring in. So they just don't get thanked enough. And I want to make sure I do that. And then also for just the professionals like you, Dr. Richardson, and I'm going to call you DMC now that you're Danielle Moss Cox. You're the new DMC, Danielle.
I've been signing my emails with that.
Hey, listen, let's go with that. I think it's important to just make sure that we are taking care of the caregivers. And Danielle, you're not just a leader, you're a mentor and a friend-tor, right? So Danielle is a person I could just call up, and I have to shout out Dr. Franklin as well, Dr. Deidre Franklin. The fact that I could just, when I was in a new role, how do I get through this, right? To be able to just talk it through with people who understand what we're going through. Because the other parts of the mental health dilemma in the Black community is that we have to be in this we have to deal with imposter syndrome in some spaces. We have to go into boardrooms and turn it on and turn it off. But I do find that as a point of power if I reshape my thinking, because I tell young people all the time, if I could show you how to work the block and the boardroom, then you're going to be a fierce individual because of your collective understanding about what's needed to have transformative communities and push out community healing. But it does wear on you. It does wear on you. And Danielle said something earlier, when you're making decisions that everybody sometimes might not agree with, leadership can be very lonely. Whether you're in a faith community as a pastor or as CEO of a nonprofit organization, sometimes you have to make critical decisions that put you in a space where you do feel lonely in. And so making sure that those persons that are in those spaces are getting the mental health supports that they need, and taking vacation time, not allowing the time to just stack up and not being able to utilize that, because to me, it's just not a fair practice to see that happen.
Right. Yeah. Who quoted it? Was it Audre Lorde? Women are the mules of the earth. Black women are the mules of the earth.
That's absolutely
the burdens that we carry, that imposter syndrome. And Adam Grant, who is a colleague at Wharton here at Penn, I think he put out on social media that this thing called passion tax, where we enjoy what we do, the work that we do, and so we put 120% in it, and it's really not reflective in our pay. It's not reflective in the acknowledgement of our service and skills, and that is really stressful for a Black woman who is in leadership right now in one of the best institutions in the nation. It's a stressful situation. I'm going to Barcelona, Spain next week. Taking care of myself and engaging in those restorative practices, because it's like, if you don't, you can become physically ill. It can exacerbate mental illness. It can, put a strain on your relationships, both at home and at work. So yeah, it's really important to pay attention to.
We have a question. Do you think schools underestimate the mental health needs of students in lower school?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I mean, just from the standpoint of what students in lower schools have access to, as opposed to what they might have had access to 30 years ago, that in itself should be why we should be paying attention to the lower schools just as we are for the upper schools.
In particular, now that, for example, developmentally, a child in third grade, essentially hasn't been in school in a year and a half to 2 years, you know? And so from a developmental perspective, I have second grade teachers who are telling me they're still teaching children the alphabet. They're still teaching them how to write their name. They're still teaching them those social skills of taking turn and standing in line. So there's some significant developmental delays that have occurred amongst certain populations with regards to, you know, your traditional learning trajectory. And, you know, one of the things that my son, who's in 11th grade, he said something very profound to me last year, right as the schools started opening back up. He said, you know, Mom, if all of my friends agreed to do it, I wouldn't mind repeating 10th grade. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, you know, I felt like I self-taught all year long, and I didn't have the social experiences that I would have loved to have had. And I just feel like I'm just being pushed along, you know, to 11th grade, to senior year, to college. And if I could hit a reset button and just do it over again, do a redo. He said, I wish the whole world would do a redo. I was like, wow, that's pretty telling.
You know, we've definitely at Oliver heard from our partner schools, who are mostly independent schools, that they are definitely seeing those academic deficits, right? So the kid who was really jazzed about ELA could continue the momentum academically, but math wasn't the same when you didn't really have that, you know, social interaction with a teacher and some other subjects. And I feel like schools are acknowledging the fact that there are going to be gaps. I'm not sure that they have positioned themselves or rethought how they approach this whole thing to really make up for it. You know, so the adults want to go back to business as usual, but a third grader this year hasn't had a normal school year since kindergarten.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it where I am now. You know, before we started, I shared that I'm a resident fellow in our dorms here at Penn. So I live with 3,000 freshmen. And you know, some of the experiences they've shared with me about their struggles from their junior, senior year in high school and how it's playing out now in their, you know, academic work and even in their socialization process here on campus, it really has had an impact. So I think, you know, going back to that question, you know, how has it impacted lower schools? I think it has impacted everyone along the educational continuum. I've clearly seen it, you know, elementary schools and working with the teachers that I work with in my private practice, high school, because I live with 2 high schoolers, and here at the college level. Developmentally, we have seen a level of regressive behaviors, both emotionally and educationally, I believe.
And I'm not sure what the solution is. You know, we're seeing, you know, we're doing placement right now. Schools are, you know, oh, you know, their your test scores are down. Of course, our test scores.
Right.
I think kids have been isolated and not really getting full instruction. I can't imagine what it would have been like to be a teacher under those circumstances. So we're seeing a lot of teachers leave the profession because in so many ways, right, these professions have failed the adults who kept the engines running. It's to me, it's criminal, the educational expectations we have for teachers to come in. You know, it's like one of the lowest paid professions relative to the level of education they want you to have, the level of debt that so many have assumed, and all the ways in which that adds to stress. I was in the classroom for 5 years, and you can't get away. Everybody thinks you get off at 3 o'clock. No, you're doing lesson
Yeah.
planning. All this free labor well into the night on my weekends,
Mhm.
that is almost invisible. And then, to have to take my little check to buy resources and materials for my classroom that should
Mhm.
have been, like, you don't tell a chef to bring their own kitchen.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
garbage man doesn't
Yeah.
have to go out and get his own garbage
Right.
truck.
Yeah.
But I spent a lot of money. And one time I actually found an old pay stub and posted it on my Facebook. And all my former students who I'm connected to were like, yo, I am so sorry.
Yeah.
I can't believe you lived on that. And, barely, right? And so, that was kind of like one of the drivers to get me out of the classroom. But, and I think we see the same thing in the nonprofit sector. I was talking to another ED who like has 700 openings.
Mhm.
She runs a
Wow.
citywide agency. She has 700 openings. Like, people are like, we're not doing that. We're not assuming that level of vicarious trauma for that
Right.
amount of money.
Right.
Well, I was reading on social media. I can't remember who posted it, but it was an educator who said that there were 26 pending resignations and retirement moves in her school alone. 26 teachers. And she broke it down, like all of the first grade teachers, 3 of the third grade
Oh
teachers,
yeah, I
like
saw that. Yeah. And
26 educators in one building. So how disruptive is that going to be for the entire system and for those kiddos? It's disheartening. It's so sad.
so before we wrap up, what would a new system look like? What would it look like to have a balanced approach to mental health for the adults and the young people in our institutions?
That's a tough one.
Yeah. I mean, I think a part of it is I'm just looking at it through the lens of the non-clinician, and then even the question that you had asked earlier about what's a solution to all of this, and for us, it's really there are many young people in underserved communities that will never be able to access paid people to tutor them to help them to
Mhm.
catch up. So it's really an appeal to the heart for those persons in the corporate community and in other sectors to really think about skills-based volunteering, where they can come in and help young people in some of those foundational subjects like science and math to catch up. The pandemic only pushed another trigger for our young people. So I've been in schools where young men would act up because they couldn't read. And rather than be embarrassed in the classroom, I'd rather you kick me out so I don't have to go through that.
Mhm.
But we don't want our young people to have to experience those things. So, what are the type of safe spaces and supportive services that we can provide? And anytime we are leveraging our community impact partners for volunteerism, for those who may not be able to mentor on a weekly basis, we have a framework called Super Mentors, where you might come in and speak on a particular subject or support in some sort of skill based opportunity. That's a solution. It helps to take a lot of the stress off of the school systems that may not have the resources that they need. So we're always trying to think about ways we can create relief
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
the very people that are supporting our young people on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So a reimagined system for me, Danielle, is just more empathy, people not finger pointing, looking at the mirror and saying, what can I do to help change this?
Mhm.
Not,
Mhm.
not taking on more than you can, but really staying in your lane.
Right. Yeah. I like that. I definitely echo what Stephen just said, and finding ways to help existing systems build capacity within. Whether it's to volunteer in the school or to relieve an individual, or I love those wellness circles you were talking about, Stephen. It's like ways in which to build that community of support. Wrapping around these schools in particular with grace, compassion, and patience. Um,
Yes. So
Yeah.
I'm going to be in touch with you, Dr. Richardson. Just know that.
Better.
That's, my mind was going in that direction as we were talking.
Mhm.
Um, as parents, right? What can we do to help support our young people's mental health, particularly when we're in situations where accessing clinical support is challenging?
Mm.
Within the context of the family, whatever that looks like. What can we as parents do differently?
I can tell you from I've had to apply extended grace. I mean,
Yes.
even with my own girls, I saw things that I'd never seen before, and I was
Yes.
ready to go in a certain direction. And I'm like, wait a minute, let me just take a step back and recognize what they're all dealing with. And what I saw initially was everybody was learning how to socialize again, right? So being separate for a year, for some young people, their home was their trauma point. They couldn't wait to get back into school. There were
Yep.
certain things that some young people didn't talk about on wellness circles because somebody might have been in earshot uh,
Hmm.
of
Mm.
them. So it's school might be the trauma point for some of our young people. Home might be the trauma point. So I just feel like extended grace across the board, especially as a parent, has really been. And then I've apologized way more than I ever have before. You know what? I'm wrong. I didn't see that. You're right. And I see my girls benefiting from that. Right? It's the I'm transferring the power to them
Hmm.
in that point. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned was, we all oftentimes go through this performance of how are you? How are you feeling? Especially with teens. And, oftentimes you get a response of, I'm fine, everything's okay, all's good. And what I have been challenged with is asking beyond that. And that is, how will I know when you're not good? How would
Mm.
I know when you're not doing well? What would it look like? What would it sound like? And I've had to ask that multiple times with my own boys. Thankfully I can joke about it now and say, when I say I survived 10th grade all over again, because I literally,
Mhm.
you know, went through 10th grade with my oldest son. And that was a real trying time for the both of us. And so again, that grace, compassion, and patience, that motto, that mantra stems from that experience. And I've tried to, expand that to other aspects of my, both personal and professional life. But truly asking the questions beyond, just the performance question, how are you? And really digging deep and letting them know that you're there, and approach whatever they might bring to you in the most non-judgmental, open way, and really provide avenues of opportunities to help them.
Oh,
So
that was such
important.
a big piece that Dr. Richards, I mean, among everything else you said, but having that non-judgmental, knowing for a young person or someone else to know that they're in a non-judgmental space is
Mhm.
huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely huge.
Because I feel like as parents, we're so good at talking about our expectations.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I have some young ones in my house again now. And so just like observing and
Mhm.
listening and letting them be the center of
Mhm.
conversation in terms of how they talk about like what happened in the playground and
Mhm.
how they handled situations and even role playing maybe how to approach those challenges in the future. um,
Mhm.
just like keeping that bag of tricks open.
Mhm.
And I think that judgment, we're all afraid of judgment, right? We saw a little
Hmm.
bit of that at the Oscars, right? That kind of
Yes,
like
we did.
need to save face, and it's all internal,
Mhm.
really. But
Mhm.
just having the tools and the skills to handle your frustrations um, in ways that are affirming. Someone's asking about how to get men to be more open about going to counseling, starting when they're younger.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about modeling and finding accountability partners.
Mhm.
Everybody wants to know what a solution looks like. But there's not enough modeling of it. There's so many schools, again, when we talk about going to counseling, there's so many schools where the male in the school might be the designated disciplinarian. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but the transformative schools are the ones where you have a lot of men, and none of those men are tasked with
Mm-hmm.
executing punitive practices to young people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the earlier the conversations, really pulling apart self-control, what does that look like? What does self-discipline look like? And then finding the informal spaces that are comfortable to young people. So meeting them where they are to have those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
For many men, there's this old saying, men do things and build relationships, women build relationships and do things. So men need things to process
Mm-hmm.
with young people to pull things apart. And I think sports has always been sort of that medium to do
Mm-hmm.
that. I love barbershops because of the intergenerational aspect of it,
Mm-hmm.
and leaving pamphlets out and people talking about it and just being very open. Almost like we need griots in this space to just really give permission to have these conversations at an earlier space, because I felt like generations before us didn't really want to push into these conversations.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. One of the things that a school that I consult with, what we came up with was develop very early on what is called a self-care plan. So in times of high stress or when they need a break, like literally have a specific plan that they wrote out, like on a simple index card, and it's taped on their desk. And one of the self-care strategies is identify someone in the building that you know you can go to for support. And it's someone beyond your teacher, because it's elementary, so beyond your teacher. So it could be the janitor, it could be the gym teacher, it could be the vice principal, someone that you can identify. And that has really helped with anchoring, the children in their school community, knowing that there is a system of support within the building, not just within their classroom. And on the flip side, what we ask teachers, and actually every adult in the building, we call it the dot project. I can't remember where I got this from, but every single student's name is put on a poster board or put on a blackboard or whatever. And every single adult in the building puts a dot next to their name. And the dot next to the child's name indicates, I know something personally about this child. I know about this child. And then they take a step back and look and see the names of those children that have no dot. And those are the ones that might slip through the cracks. And so the teachers and the administrators and the school personnel are assigned the task of identifying one of those students without the dot and make themselves known to that student. And so it's again, it's like this community of care within the system. So those kind of different strategies.
And one other thing that I wanted to add, in terms of getting more men to go to counseling, and because I've heard this quite often from mothers seeking counseling for their boys, they're specifically asking for male counselors. So there are a lot of men and boys that won't go to counseling if they don't feel like they're going to have a man to talk to. I think we should all be open to whomever is willing, and because it's, people are competent across the board, regardless of what the gender is. But there's some people who won't take that first step if they don't feel like they have it. So as we're building these resources, we should be very aware of, here are Black women who are available for mentoring. I mean, for counseling. Here are Black men who are available. The Latinx community here, because there's a cultural piece to this. I saw a question earlier. I think it was from someone who was mentioning immigrants and Caribbean immigrants. I mean, so just understanding the complexities of what makes us feel comfortable, but the broader we have in terms of resources, I think it creates a better menu for people to take that step in getting counseling.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much. I don't know if you have any final words of wisdom. I appreciate you taking this time away from your families and other obligations to talk to us. This conversation will be available on the Oliver Scholars YouTube channel for those who want to share the wealth of knowledge that we got from Dr. Richardson and Stephen. I feel so honored and blessed to have you both in my circle. I appreciate you. Even if we don't talk that often, we still all people. So I appreciate you both. And just like the amazing work that you're both doing in the spaces that you occupy.
And now you're my neighbor, so you don't have an excuse.
I know it's horrible. Barely left the house in 2 years.
Right.
That's a whole other conversation.
Wow. Well, thank you, Danielle. I so appreciate this opportunity. And Stephen, it was great talking with you.
Oh, this is not the end, Dr. Richardson. I will be in touch with you. It was an
He
absolute honor.
means that, Marcia. He will be following up.
I mean that too. Yes, let's do this. All right.